I don't remember the first time I realized I wasn't wanted. Maybe it was the quiet sigh my mother would release whenever I entered the room, or the way my father's face lit up only when my brother, Ryan, spoke. Maybe it was the hundreds of little ways I was ignored, dismissed, overlooked. What I do remember is the suffocating loneliness of growing up in a house that never felt like home. I used to try. Oh, how I tried. As a child, I thought love was something you could earn, something that could be tallied up in gold stars and report cards. I threw myself into my schoolwork, desperate to be noticed, to be good enough. Straight A's, honor roll, science fair ribbons, debate team victories. I collected them all like trophies, hoping each achievement would buy me a little sliver of my parents' attention. But it never did. Ryan, my younger brother, barely had to lift a finger to be showered in praise. If he so much as colored inside the lines, my mother would pin it to the fridge like it was a masterpiece. If he stumbled through a piano recital, my father would tell anyone who'd listen that his son was a prodigy. Meanwhile, my perfect grades were met with indifference. Once, in the 3rd grade, I won a regional spelling bee. I came home clutching my trophy, heart pounding with excitement. I walked into the kitchen where my mother was making Ryan's favorite spaghetti, the smell of garlic and tomatoes thick in the air. "Mom," I beamed, holding out my trophy. "I won." She barely glanced at it before turning back to the stove. "That's nice, Melanie. Could you set the table?" "Ryan's hungry." I stood there, the heavy trophy cooling in my hands, my throat tightening. That was the moment something inside me cracked. The favoritism wasn't just in small things, it was everywhere. My birthdays were afterthoughts, while Ryan's were grand celebrations with balloons and cakes and presents that filled an entire table. When I wanted a bike, I was told we couldn't afford one. When Ryan wanted one, my parents surprised him with the most expensive model in the store. It wasn't just my parents, either. Relatives, family, friends, they all followed the same script. Ryan is such a smart boy. Ryan is going to do great things. And then, if I was lucky enough to be acknowledged at all, I was the quiet one, the responsible one, as if my very existence was just an accessory to my brother's story. As the years passed, I stopped expecting things to change. I stopped running to them with my victories, stopped hoping for their approval. It was a slow, painful realization, the kind that settled into my bones. No matter what I did, I would always be second best. By the time I reached high school, I had learned to navigate life without their support. I became independent out of necessity. I picked up part-time jobs, tutoring other students, babysitting for neighbors, saving every dollar I could because I knew that when the time came, I wouldn't have the luxury of relying on my parents the way Ryan would. Ryan, who crashed his first car, bought brand new by my father, within months of getting his license, only to have my parents replace it with another. Ryan, who barely scraped by in school but was constantly reassured that he was destined for greatness. And then there was me, working late shifts to save for college applications, knowing full well that if I failed, there would be no safety net waiting to catch me. One day, I overheard my parents talking about me. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the door to the living room was slightly ajar, and their voices carried down the hall. "I don't know why she always has this attitude," my mother was saying. "She's so distant," my father agreed. "Always acting like she's better than us. She's just difficult." Difficult. That was the word my mother used to describe me. Not hardworking, not determined, just difficult. I walked away before I could hear more, but the damage had already been done. I knew then that it didn't matter if I was obedient, if I was successful, if I was the perfect daughter. I would always be a burden in their eyes. I would always be unwanted. The final blow came on my 18th birthday. I had spent the evening alone in my room, finishing a school project. I hadn't expected a party or even a cake, but I thought, just maybe, there would be some acknowledgement. A card. A happy birthday. Something. Instead, my parents were in the living room, fussing over Ryan's basketball game. When I finally walked in, standing awkwardly near the door, my mother glanced up and said, "Oh, that's right. It's your birthday, isn't it?" She didn't even wait for my response before turning back to Ryan. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. Yeah, it is. My father reached for his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill, handing it to me without looking up. Here, get yourself something. Ryan, sitting comfortably on the couch, grinned. You should be grateful, Mel. You didn't even have to earn that one. Something in me snapped. I took the 20, folded it neatly, and placed it on the coffee table. Then I turned and walked back to my room, shutting the door quietly behind me. That was the night I made a promise to myself. I would never beg for their love again. I would never seek their approval, never wait for a scrap of attention, never try to fit into a space that was never meant for me. I was done trying to be a part of a family that had already decided I wasn't enough. From that moment on, my life would be my own. From the moment I made that promise to myself, my focus became singular, getting out. I buried myself in schoolwork, pushing harder than ever before. If my parents weren't going to notice me, if I was never going to be enough for them, then I would build a life where their approval didn't matter. I would carve out my own path, and nothing, not their indifference, not their favoritism, not even the gnawing loneliness that crept into my bones, would stop me. I didn't just want to succeed. I had to succeed. And so, I studied late into the night, long after my family had gone to bed. I stayed after school for tutoring, not because I needed help but because it gave me a quiet space to work. I signed up for every AP class, every academic club, every scholarship opportunity. I had no safety net. No one waiting to catch me if I failed. And I refused to fail. It wasn't easy. There were nights when exhaustion weighed on me so heavily that my vision blurred over the textbooks. Days when I watched my classmates laugh and talk about weekend plans, knowing I couldn't afford to join them. Times when I felt so isolated that I almost let the bitterness consume me. But I reminded myself this was temporary. I wasn't meant to stay here. The day I received my first college acceptance letter, I held my breath as I tore open the envelope. My hands trembled as I scanned the words. Congratulations. Relief and triumph swelled in my chest. It was happening. I was getting out. More letters followed. Some came with scholarships, some with partial aid. But there was one letter I had been waiting for, the one I had dared to hope for, the full-ride scholarship. When it arrived, I sat on my bed for a long time, staring at it, letting the reality sink in. I had done it. I had secured my own future. For the first time in my life, I felt like I won. I walked into the kitchen that evening, my heart pounding, half wondering if this would finally be the moment my parents looked at me with pride. Mom, Dad, I said, unable to keep the excitement from my voice. I got the full-ride scholarship. My mother barely looked up from her phone. That's nice, Melanie. I stood there, waiting, hoping, but that was it. Just that's nice. My father glanced at me briefly, then turned back to his plate. Ryan, sitting across from them, smirked. Well, I guess that means you won't be asking Mom and Dad for money, huh? I clenched my jaw, my fists tightening at my sides. Of course. Of course, this was how they would react. I swallowed down the anger burning in my throat and turned to leave, but then I heard my mother's voice again. You know, she said, Ryan got promoted to varsity basketball this week. Isn't that great? My stomach twisted. This week. They had known about his promotion for days, probably celebrated it, and I was just now hearing about it. Meanwhile, I had walked in with a life-changing opportunity, and it had barely earned a second glance. I didn't say another word. I didn't cry. I didn't let them see how much it hurt. Instead, I walked upstairs, sat at my desk, and stared at the scholarship letter. That night, I filled out my dorm request form. I wasn't just leaving for college. I was never coming back. The day I moved into my dorm, I packed my things alone. My parents didn't offer to help. There were no tearful goodbyes, no last-minute words of encouragement. Just a casual drive safe from my father and a distracted wave from my mother. Ryan wasn't even home. I should have expected it, but it still stung. Hannah, Jason's sister, was the one who showed up to help. She had been my closest friend since high school, and unlike my own family, she actually cared. I still can't believe they didn't come with you, she muttered as she helped carry my boxes to the car. It's a huge deal, Mel. I forced a smile. It's fine. I don't need them. Hannah didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. When we arrived at my dorm, she helped me unpack, making jokes to lighten the mood. By the time she left, my room finally felt mine. That first night in my dorm, I sat on my bed and stared out the window, watching the lights of the city below. For the first time in my life, I was free. No more desperate attempts to win their approval. No more being overshadowed by Ryan. This was my fresh start. And I was never looking back. As the years passed, my relationship with my family grew more distant. I called on holidays, but the conversations were always brief, filled with small talk and empty pleasantries. My mother would ask about school in the same tone she might ask about the weather. My father would hand the phone off to Ryan, who never failed to remind me how much fun I was missing at home. I learned not to expect anything from them. And yet, despite everything, I still felt the lingering ache of being unwanted. I told myself it didn't matter. I had built a life outside of them. I had friends who cared. Professors who noticed my hard work. A future that was entirely my own. And yet, every time I overheard a classmate talking about visiting home for the weekend, or saw pictures of family gatherings on social media, that old wound would throb again. I wasn't just distant from my family. I was alone. By the time I graduated, I had made peace with it, or at least I thought I had. I walked across that stage, diploma in hand, and felt a swell of pride that no one could take from me. But when I stepped outside and saw the other graduates surrounded by their cheering families, I couldn't stop my eyes from searching. Looking for someone who wasn't there. Looking for parents who had never been proud of me, who had never wanted me. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced myself to smile as Hannah ran up to hug me. "Look at you," she beamed. "I'm so proud of you, Mel." She said it so easily, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As if I was worth being proud of. I hugged her back, gripping her tightly, and whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time, I realized maybe I didn't need my parents' love. Maybe I just needed to surround myself with people who actually cared. So that's what I did. I moved to a new city, found a job I loved, built a life entirely on my own terms. And for a while, it was enough. But then, one day, I met Jason. And everything changed. I met Jason on a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air smelled of fallen leaves and the city lights flickered against the darkening sky. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. Not the kind you read about in books where two people lock eyes and know instantly that they're meant to be. No, it was slow, steady, something I had never known I needed until it was there. I had been working late at the office, something that had become routine for me. My job in finance demanded long hours, but I didn't mind. Work gave me purpose. It was something I was good at, something that didn't require the approval of anyone but myself. That night, I stopped by a small cafe to grab a coffee before heading home, exhausted but unwilling to call it a night just yet. And that's when I saw him, sitting at a corner table, staring at his laptop with an expression of pure frustration. I don't know what made me approach him. Maybe it was the way he rubbed his temples like he had been staring at the screen for hours. Maybe it was the way he muttered something under his breath, a quiet damn it that made me smirk. "You look like you need another coffee," I said before I could stop myself. Jason looked up, startled, and then smiled, a little sheepish, a little amused. "That obvious, huh?" I shrugged. Just a little. And just like that, a conversation started. He was working on a presentation for a big pitch at his company. I offered a few suggestions, half expecting him to brush me off, but instead, he listened, really listened. One coffee turned into 2, then 3. By the time I glanced at my watch, it was nearly midnight. "I should probably let you finish your work," I said, standing to leave. Jason hesitated, then asked, "Can I take you to dinner sometime? As a thank you for saving my project?" I hesitated too, but for a different reason. Relationships had never been a priority for me. I had spent so much of my life focused on proving myself that I had never really let anyone in. But something about Jason made me pause. Made me consider. I gave him my number, half expecting him to never call. But he did. And one dinner turned into late-night talks, weekend trips, whispered conversations in the dark where I told him things I had never told anyone. Jason was different. He didn't just tolerate my independence, he admired it. He never made me feel like I had to fight for his attention. He listened. He cared. For the first time, I felt what it was like to be chosen. Loved. It terrified me. For so long, I had convinced myself that I didn't need anyone. That I was better off alone. But Jason made me question that belief. He made me want something I had never dared to hope for, a future with someone who saw me. And so, when he proposed on a quiet evening in our small apartment, I said yes. Not because I needed him, but because, for the first time in my life, I wanted someone. Marriage was nothing like the cold, distant relationships I had grown up witnessing. It was warm, steady, filled with small moments that made the big ones even more meaningful. We built a home together, not just a physical space, but a place where I felt safe, where I felt wanted. And then, 2 years later, we welcomed our daughter, Sophia. The first time I held her in my arms, I felt something crack open inside me, something I hadn't even realized was locked away. She was so tiny, so perfect, her little fingers curling around mine as she blinked up at me. In that moment, I made her a promise. I would never let her feel the way I had felt growing up. She would always know she was loved, always know she was enough. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Like I had created something that was truly mine. And for a while, it was perfect. Until it wasn't. The change in Jason wasn't sudden. It was subtle, creeping in like a shadow at the edges of our life. He started coming home later. His smiles felt forced. Conversations that once lasted for hours dwindled to short, distracted answers. I tried to ignore it at first. Told myself he was just busy, that work was stressful, that marriage was supposed to have ups and downs. But deep down, I knew. The distance between us wasn't just about work. It was about something else. And one evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the truth came spilling out. "I need to tell you something," Jason said, his voice tight. I knew what was coming before he even said the words. "There's someone else." The room went silent. My hands curled around my fork, my stomach twisting. "How long?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. "A few months," he admitted. I nodded slowly, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to stay still. "She means something to you," I said, more a statement than a question. Jason's silence was my answer. And just like that, the life I had built, the family I had fought so hard to create, cracked down the middle. The divorce was civil. I refused to beg, refused to let this turn into another battle where I had to prove my worth. Jason didn't fight me on custody. Sophia would live with me, but he would remain in her life. I told myself I was fine, that I had survived worse, that I had been alone before, and I could be alone again. But the truth was, this was different. Because now I had something to lose. Someone who depended on me. And no matter how much it hurt, I couldn't afford to break. I had to be strong for Sophia. For us. Jason left, but his family didn't. Hannah was there the day I packed up his things. His parents still called, still visited, still treated Sophia like she was the most precious thing in the world. I hadn't expected them to stay, but they did. And for the first time in my life, I realized family wasn't just the people you were born to. It was the people who showed up. The people who stayed. And so, as I tucked Sophia into bed at night, as I listened to her soft breathing, as I kissed her forehead and whispered "I love you," I made another promise. We would be okay. Even without Jason. Even without the perfect marriage I had dreamed of. Because I wasn't alone. And neither was she. I never thought I'd try again. After Jason left, I told myself that was it. I had learned my lesson. Love was fragile, conditional, fleeting. It could disappear just as easily as it came, and I wasn't going to waste my time chasing after it anymore. But the thing about motherhood is that it forces you to keep going, even when you don't want to. Sophia needed me. She needed a mother who wasn't drowning in resentment, a mother who wasn't bitter and closed off. So I pushed forward, not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. And for a while, I convinced myself that I didn't need anything else. I had my daughter. I had my job. I had my independence. That was enough. Or at least, I thought it was. But then, against my better judgment, I found myself reaching out to my parents again. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe deep down, I still wanted their approval. Maybe I thought that, now that I was a mother myself, they would finally see me differently. That they would recognize how hard I was working, how much I was sacrificing, and finally say the words I had been waiting my entire life to hear: "We're proud of you." But of course, that didn't happen. At first, they seemed interested. My mother would call every few weeks, asking about Sophia, making polite conversation. My father would comment on how strong I was for handling single motherhood alone. For a brief, fleeting moment, I let myself believe that things were changing. That maybe, just maybe, I was finally earning my place in their world. But then the requests started. At first, it was small things. "Could you help cover a bill this month? Money's a little tight. We need some repairs done at the house. Just a loan. We'll pay you back." I should have seen it for what it was. But I wanted to believe that they cared. So I helped. Every time they asked, I sent money. Not because I had extra to spare, I didn't. I was working full-time, paying for daycare, trying to rebuild my life from the ground up. But every dollar I sent felt like an investment, like I was buying their love, their approval, their recognition. I told myself it was worth it. That this time, things were different. Until, one day, I overheard my mother on the phone. I had called to check in, to ask if they wanted to visit Sophia. My mother had answered distractedly, barely listening. Then, without realizing she hadn't hung up, she muttered, "She's so desperate to be included, isn't she?" I froze. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. And then I heard my father's response, his low chuckle, the one I had grown up hearing when they talked about me behind my back. "Well, as long as she keeps paying, let her think whatever she wants." The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, my hands trembling. And then, for the first time in years, I cried. Not because I was surprised, but because, deep down, I had known all along. I stopped sending money after that. At first, my parents pretended not to notice. My mother still called, still asked about Sophia, still played the role of the doting grandmother. But when the money didn't come, the conversations grew shorter. Then they stopped altogether. And just like that, the fragile illusion shattered. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love, trying to be enough. And in the end, all I had ever been to them was a convenience. A wallet. But I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't the little girl who stood in the kitchen with a spelling bee trophy, waiting for a congratulations that never came. I wasn't the teenager who stayed up late studying, hoping good grades would finally make her parents see her. I was a mother now. And I would be damned if I let my daughter grow up feeling the way I had. So I let them go. Not in anger. Not in bitterness. But in quiet, resolute finality. I deleted their numbers. I blocked their emails. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Hannah was the first to notice the change. "You seem lighter," she said one evening as we sat on her porch, watching Sophia chase fireflies in the yard. I took a slow sip of my tea, watching the golden glow of the setting sun. I think I finally let go of something I should have let go of years ago. Hannah didn't press for details. She didn't need to. She had been there through everything. She knew. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you, Mel." The words hit me harder than I expected. I swallowed, blinking back the sudden sting in my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. And for the first time, I let myself believe it. The months passed, and life settled into something close to happiness. Sophia was growing, thriving, filling my world with laughter and love in ways I had never imagined. Jason's family remained a constant presence. His parents adored Sophia, treating her like the light of their lives. Hannah became more than just a friend. She became family. And somewhere along the way, I realized something. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. The people who had truly cared had always been there. I had just been too blinded by the past to see it. One evening, as I tucked Sophia into bed, she looked up at me with those bright, inquisitive eyes. "Mommy," she asked sleepily, "are Grandma and Grandpa coming to visit?" She meant Jason's parents, of course. The only grandparents she had ever truly known. I smiled, brushing a curl from her forehead. Of course they are, sweetheart. She grinned, satisfied, then rolled onto her side, her tiny hands clutching her stuffed rabbit. As I stood there, watching her drift to sleep, a quiet realization settled over me. I had spent so many years chasing a family that never wanted me. And all along, I had been building one of my own. One that actually loved me. One that didn't make me beg for scraps of affection. One that saw me, truly saw me, and said, "You're enough." And for the first time in my life, I believed it. Pain is a strange thing. It comes in waves, sometimes sharp and sudden, other times slow and creeping, like a shadow stretching at dusk. I never considered myself fragile. I had survived too much to be anything but strong. But that night, curled up in my office chair, clutching my stomach, I felt fragile. The pain had started as a dull ache earlier in the day, a discomfort I had ignored, pushing through meetings and emails. I had always been good at ignoring discomfort. Years of being unwanted had trained me well. But as the hours dragged on, the ache sharpened into something unbearable, a searing, twisting agony that left me breathless. My hands trembled as I pressed them to my abdomen, sweat beading on my forehead. I tried to breathe through it, tried to convince myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. A sharp gasp tore from my lips as another wave of pain hit, so intense that my vision blurred. I reached for my phone, my fingers unsteady. Sophia. The thought of her cut through the pain, cold and sharp. She was at school. I was supposed to pick her up in an hour. But I couldn't even stand. Panic tightened around my chest as I scrolled through my contacts. I hesitated only a second before pressing the number I had once sworn I would never call again. My mother picked up after 3 rings. "Melanie?" Her voice was distracted, disinterested. I swallowed hard, forcing the words out between shallow breaths. "Mom, I need help." A pause. "What's wrong?" "I'm in a lot of pain," I gasped. I think I need to go to the hospital. Can you pick up Sophia from school? Just for a day until I..." Another wave of pain stole my breath. I heard my mother sigh on the other end of the line, and for a fleeting moment, relief flooded me. She was going to help. She was going to. "We can't." The words were sharp. Final. I blinked, my pulse roaring in my ears. "What?" "We're busy tonight," she said, like she was turning down dinner plans instead of abandoning her daughter in a moment of crisis. My mind struggled to process it. I forced myself to speak, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm being serious, Mom. I think I need emergency surgery. I just need you to take care of Sophia for a few days. Please." Another sigh. This one irritated, like I was being unreasonable. "Melanie, we already made plans. Ryan got promoted at work. We're hosting a party for him tonight." My stomach twisted, but this time, it wasn't from the pain. I was begging, and she still wouldn't. "I can't believe this," I choked out, tears burning in my eyes. My mother's voice turned cold. "You always make everything so dramatic. You're not the only person who has things to deal with, you know." Her words hit harder than any pain I was feeling. But she wasn't finished. "Sophia isn't our responsibility, Melanie. She's your burden." My world went silent. For a moment, I forgot about the pain in my stomach. All I could feel was the sharp sting of betrayal, the crushing weight of a lifetime of being unwanted pressing down on me all over again. A burden. That was what my daughter was to her. That was what I had always been. I didn't say another word. I ended the call. I sat there, my phone clutched in my shaking hands, and let myself feel it, the raw, ugly truth I had spent years trying to ignore. They were never going to love me. They were never going to care. No matter how much I begged, no matter how much I gave, I would always be second to Ryan. I would always be an afterthought. And Sophia? They didn't see her as family. They saw her as an inconvenience. I wiped my tears away roughly. I didn't have time for this. I needed help. I needed to get help. And so, with the last bit of strength I had left, I called Hannah. She answered on the first ring. "Mel?" Hey, what's wrong? I hadn't realized I was crying until I tried to speak and my voice broke. I need help, I whispered. I think I need to go to the hospital. Hannah didn't hesitate. Where are you? I'm on my way. I woke up to the steady beep of a heart monitor. The hospital room was dim, the soft hum of machines filling the space. My body ached, but the pain was dull now, softened by medication. And then I heard a voice, soft, familiar. She's okay? Hannah. I turned my head, blinking against the haze. She was standing near the door, talking to a nurse. Her eyes were red, her hair slightly disheveled, like she had been sitting here for hours. The nurse nodded. The surgery went well. She's going to need some rest, but she'll be okay. Relief flooded Hannah's face, and then she turned, realizing I was awake. Hey, she said, rushing to my bedside. You scared the hell out of me. I tried to smile, but my lips trembled. Sophia? She's with my parents, Hannah reassured me. She's safe. Don't worry. Tears filled my eyes. Of course they had stepped up. Not my parents. Not my own flesh and blood. But Hannah's family. The people who had been there for me more times than I could count. Hannah sat down beside me, squeezing my hand. I called your mom, she admitted, her voice tight with anger. I thought, God, Mel, I thought she'd want to know. But she said she was too busy celebrating. Something in me shattered. But then, something else clicked into place. A cold, hard certainty. I had spent my whole life trying to prove my worth to people who didn't deserve me. I had given and given and given, only to be discarded the moment I truly needed them. And I was done. Done begging. Done hoping. Done hurting over people who had never once put me first. I squeezed Hannah's hand back, my grip steadier than I expected. Thank you, I whispered. She frowned. For what? I swallowed, my throat raw. For being my family. Hannah's eyes softened. Mel, you've always been my family. And with that, I let go of the last piece of my past that had been holding me back. My parents didn't deserve me. But the people who had stood by me, the people who had shown up, they were the only family I would ever need. Recovery was slow. My body ached, my movements were stiff, and exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. But the pain of my surgery was nothing compared to the weight that had finally lifted from my chest. I was done. Done begging. Done waiting. Done hoping that my parents would be anything other than what they had always been, distant, indifferent, and conditional in their affection. For the first time in my life, I saw things clearly. They had abandoned me in my moment of greatest need, discarded me without a second thought. And yet, I had still been holding on, still craving even the smallest acknowledgement, still handing them pieces of myself in exchange for nothing. But not anymore. Lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by people who had chosen to be there, I made a decision. It was time to cut them out. Completely. And this time, I wouldn't look back. Hannah stayed with me through most of my recovery, making sure I had everything I needed. Her parents took care of Sophia, treating her like their own granddaughter, showering her with love and warmth in a way my parents never had. When I was finally strong enough to return home, Hannah helped me settle back in. She didn't ask about my parents. She didn't need to. She knew. And I knew she was waiting for me to say it. To finally say the words I had been holding back for years. I didn't make her wait long. One evening, as she tucked Sophia into bed, I sat at the kitchen table, my phone in my hands. I scrolled through the old text messages from my parents, the ones asking for money, the brief, emotionless updates, the cold replies that always made it clear that I was an obligation, not a daughter. Then, with a deep breath, I deleted them all. Blocked their numbers. Blocked their emails. And just like that, they were gone. It should have felt devastating. But all I felt was relief. At first, there was silence. No calls. No messages. Just the quiet absence of something that had never really been there to begin with. And for the first time, I let myself feel that absence, not as a loss, but as a release. I was free. I had spent my entire life chasing something that had never existed, fighting for a love that had always been out of reach. But now? Now I had a family who actually chose me. Hannah. Her parents. Even Jason, despite everything, remained in Sophia's life in a way that my own parents had never been in mine. And that was enough. That was more than enough. The days turned into weeks. I went back to work, back to the rhythm of my life. Sophia thrived, surrounded by people who adored her. And I found myself smiling more, laughing more, living more. There was no more waiting for an approval that would never come. No more bending over backward for people who only saw me as a source of financial support. I was done. Truly, completely done. Until, 4 months later, the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the moment I heard the voice on the other end, my stomach twisted. Melanie, my mother said, her voice sickly sweet, the kind of false warmth she used when she wanted something. I almost hung up right then. But I didn't. Not yet. Because I needed to hear it. I needed to hear why, after months of silence, she was suddenly reaching out. "Mom," I said flatly, waiting. There was a brief pause, as if she was waiting for me to say something more. To ask how she was. To tell her I had missed her. I didn't. She sighed, and then, just like that, the act dropped. "Listen, we need your help." I nearly laughed. Of course they did. "What do you need, Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully even. She hesitated, just for a moment, before launching into it. "It's your father and me," she said. "We've hit a rough patch financially. And, well, Ryan refuses to help us." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. There it was. The reason she had finally remembered I existed. Not because she missed me. Not because she regretted what had happened. But because the golden child had turned his back on them, and now they had no one left to leech from. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. "Let me get this straight," I said calmly. "Ryan, the son you've spent your entire life worshipping, won't help you. So now, after months of ignoring me, you suddenly remember that I exist." My mother made a sound of irritation. "Melanie, don't be difficult. We're family." That word. That cursed, hollow word. I had spent my entire life chasing after family, yearning for it, breaking myself into pieces just to fit into a mold they had never intended to include me in. But not anymore. I had a real family now. And they weren't them. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "No," I said simply. "We're not." A stunned silence followed. And then, "Melanie." But I was already hanging up. Already blocking the number. Already done. For good. That night, as I sat with Hannah and her parents in their living room, watching Sophia play with her toys, I felt something settle inside me. Something final. Something freeing. I had spent my life waiting for a family that never truly existed. But in the end, I had built my own. And it was enough. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the world felt soft and slow. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, warming the hardwood floors as Sophia sat at the kitchen table, crayons scattered around her, carefully drawing on a large piece of paper. I sipped my coffee, watching her from the counter. There was something peaceful about the moment, something whole. "Mommy," Sophia said, tilting her head as she focused on her drawing. "Yes, sweetheart." She tapped the paper with her crayon. "I'm making a family tree for school." I set my mug down, walking over to look. Her small fingers traced the branches she had drawn, names written in bright, looping letters. There was Mommy at the center. And next to me was Sophia, drawn with a tiny smile. Hannah was there, too. So were Jason's parents, their names carefully written with little hearts beside them. But as I scanned the page, my breath caught. My parents' names weren't there. Ryan's name wasn't there. It wasn't an accident. She had chosen. Just as I had. I knelt beside her, my chest tightening as I ran my fingers over the paper. "This is beautiful, sweetheart." Sophia grinned. "Do you like it?" "I love it," I whispered. She turned her big, bright eyes to me. "Did I forget anyone?" I swallowed hard, my throat aching, but I shook my head. "No, baby. It's perfect." Because it was. Because this small, imperfect, chosen family was the only one that mattered. I pressed a kiss to Sophia's forehead, breathing her in, feeling the warmth of her tiny hands as they wrapped around mine. For years, I had begged for love. For years, I had fought to belong. But I never had to fight for this. And I never would. I had finally found my family. And I was never looking back. Mornings in our home had a rhythm. The scent of coffee filled the kitchen as sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the wooden table where Sophia sat with her crayons. The soft sound of her coloring filled the space, punctuated by the occasional hum of a tune she had picked up from school. I stood by the counter, my fingers wrapped around a warm mug, watching her as she worked. There was something peaceful about this, the simple, quiet certainty of our life together. No tension, no strained conversations, no aching need for approval that would never come. Just us. Sophia lifted her head, her bright eyes meeting mine. "Mommy, I'm making a family tree for school." A small smile tugged at my lips. "That sounds fun." She nodded, her tiny fingers gripping a green crayon as she added lines, branching out from a central name written in large, careful letters. "Mommy." "Do you want to see?" she asked, excitement in her voice. I set my coffee down and walked over, kneeling beside her chair. My gaze moved over the drawing, my heart tightening as I took in what she had created. At the center was me, Mommy, with a small heart drawn beside my name. Directly below me, in big, bold letters, was Sophia, her own name circled with bright yellow. On one side, she had drawn Hannah, her name surrounded by swirls and little stars. Next to her were Jason's parents, Grandma and Grandpa Richards, both outlined in warm shades of orange and red. But as I looked closer, my breath caught. My parents' names weren't there. Ryan's name wasn't there. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Sophia had drawn her family. The people who showed up. The people who loved her, who loved us. And my parents, the ones who had abandoned me, who had turned their backs on us when we needed them most, were nowhere to be seen. A lump formed in my throat. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "This is beautiful, sweetheart," I said softly. She beamed up at me, her curls bouncing as she nodded. "Do you like it?" I ran my fingers over the paper, my chest tightening with something that felt too big to name. "I love it," I whispered. Sophia tapped the tree with her crayon. "Did I forget anyone?" I hesitated, my fingers brushing over the empty space where my parents' names should have been. And then, slowly, I shook my head. "No, baby," I murmured. "It's perfect." Because it was. Because this small, imperfect, chosen family was the only one that mattered. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with Hannah, the quiet hum of cicadas filling the air around us. She was sipping a glass of wine, her feet propped up on the railing, her face relaxed in the dim glow of the porch light. "So," she said, stretching out the word as she turned to look at me. "Are we going to talk about what's on your mind, or am I supposed to guess?" I let out a slow breath, staring at the stars overhead. "Sophia made a family tree for school today." Hannah raised a brow. "Yeah?" I nodded, rolling the stem of my wine glass between my fingers. "She didn't put my parents on it. Or Ryan." Hannah didn't say anything right away. She just let the words sit there, giving me space to process them. After a moment, she asked, "How do you feel about that?" I was quiet for a long time, sifting through the tangle of emotions inside me. And then I realized there was no sadness, no grief, no aching sense of loss. Just peace. "I think," I said slowly, "that I finally let go." Hannah smiled, her eyes warm. "Yeah," she murmured. "I think you did." I exhaled, leaning back against the chair. For so long, I had fought against the truth. I had convinced myself that if I just worked harder, if I just proved myself, my parents would finally love me the way I had always wanted them to. But Sophia had never known that kind of love, the conditional, fleeting, suffocating kind. She only knew real love. The kind that stayed. The kind that didn't need to be earned. She had drawn her family. And my parents weren't part of it. Not because I had told her to leave them out. But because, in her innocent, beautiful way, she already knew what had taken me years to accept. Family wasn't about blood. It was about who showed up. The next morning, I woke to the sound of little feet padding into my room. Mommy? I blinked, groggy, as Sophia climbed into bed beside me. Her small arms wrapped around me, her head resting against my chest. I kissed the top of her head. What is it, baby? She was quiet for a moment, her fingers playing with the fabric of my shirt. Then, in a soft voice, she asked, "You're happy, right?" I froze. She was looking up at me now, her big, earnest eyes searching mine. "You're happy," she repeated, more certain this time. With me. With us. Tears burned at the back of my throat. I cupped her face, brushing her curls back. "Sweetheart," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm happier than I've ever been." She smiled, curling closer, and I held her tightly, my heart full in a way I had never known it could be. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was chasing something that was always just out of reach. I wasn't waiting for someone to choose me, because I had already been chosen. By Sophia, by Hannah, by the people who had always been there. And that was enough. That was everything. As I held my daughter in my arms, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against mine, I whispered a promise into the quiet morning air. You will always know love. She would never feel the way I had. She would never question her worth. She would never have to fight to be seen. Because she was enough. Because we were enough. And for the first time in my life, I truly, completely believed it.